but do please shout if not. Perfect. First and foremost, a very huge thank you to the Grantham Research Institute, as per usual, for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to give them a proper shout out, the Grantham Research Institute carries out world-leading multidisciplinary research into the environment and climate change. And with us here today, we have Emily and Kate. So if you do want to find out more about what they do, please do find them during the break. Some of the main work that the Institute does is the Climate Laws of the World, which is the world's most comprehensive database of climate change laws, regulatory frameworks, as well as UNFCCC documents. And of course, they also release the Global Trends in Climate Litigation snapshot every year, which captures new developments in climate change litigation. So thank you very much to the Institute. And if you would like more information, there's some on the slides as well. Do follow the QR codes if you would like to sign up on their newsletter. And yeah, so just some more points about the space that we're in today. We're not expecting any fires, but if there is a fire alarm, please do exit the building. Don't stay here. The staircase will be just where the elevators were. So hopefully you can find your way down the hallway. And across from the elevators is also where the bathrooms are, if you do need them at any point. We are next to a kitchen, so if anyone needs to fill up their water bottles, please feel free to do so during the break. Now, it's very nice, as always, to see a lot of familiar faces here, but if you do happen to be new, let me just tell you a little bit about Legal Voices for the Future. So my name is Dominika. I'm on the Stewardship Committee of Legal Voices, and we are an organization run by early career legal practitioners. And our goal is to bring young lawyers together to talk about issues surrounding climate change and the biodiversity crisis, which of course are some of the main issues facing humanity today. And one of the main ways in which we do that is through hosting monthly knowledge sessions, such as the one we have here. And our past topics ranged from greenwashing to decarbonizing the shipping sector. So we do cover a wide range of things. But we're also always on the lookout for new knowledge session ideas. So if you do have a subject that you're passionate about, please do feel free to reach out to us and suggest your own knowledge session. We would be more than happy to help you out with organizing and running your own event. You can find out more information about us on the slides as well, and we will just occasionally plug some QR codes throughout the slides as well, and we'll leave them at the end of the presentation. Now, just like all of our events, this one will be split into 3 parts. So first we will have our lovely speaker Riley here introduce us to the subject. We will then have a discussion with our panel of speakers, and we thank them for being here, and we really can't wait to hear from them. We will have a small comfort break, and then we will have our creative content part of the evening. Now, this is an opportunity for us to come together kind of more informally and perhaps reflect on everything that we've heard. And we do receive feedback from people consistently who tell us that this is their favorite part of the evening. So please, if you can, please do stay until the end so that you can experience it as well. And yeah, without further ado, I'll pass on to Riley.
Thank you very much. Just to add, there is also a 4th part of our evening, which is we have got all bar 1 booked. So if nothing else keeps you around, maybe the pub will, but hopefully this will be interesting. So yeah, without further ado, I shall move us on to the first part of our presentation. Maybe I won't. I will. So yeah, I thought it'd be nice to do a little intro to who I am first, because some of you in the room might know me quite well. Some of you probably don't know me at all. So my name is Riley. I'm a lawyer at McFarland's in the litigation and dispute resolution team. But I'm also someone who really cares about animals and how the law interacts with the lives of different animals, from domestic ones to wild ones. So I've spent a lot of time educating myself on this topic, but I'm by no means an expert. I'm actually standing in front of you this evening as someone who really cares. And why? Josh, you've heard this story before, so apologies. It all started probably, I'm going to be showing my age a little bit, but about 10 years ago when I was sat around my dining room table, and weirdly, I was eating a bowl of baked beans, and I opened a letter from a charity called Four Paws. And on the front page of that letter was a sun bear, and that sun bear had been traded illegally as part of the traditional medicine trade and was being used for its bile. And I won't tell you what horrible condition it was in, but I'll tell you it lives rent-free in my head. And it's probably why I started learning about all of these things. And then COVID happened. And I was like, wow, there must be a connection between the illegal wildlife trade and zoonotic disease. So I spent a long time sort of educating myself about this. And as I said, I'm standing in front of you this evening, not as someone who is a total expert on the topic, but as someone who really, really cares about it, in the hope that someone in this room, even if it's my mum, walks away this evening feeling educated and feeling like you can also make the world a better place for animals. Because I personally believe that together, the law can, will, and should make the world a better place for animals if we use it collectively. So as Dominique has said, we've got 3 parts to this evening: a presentation, a panel interview, and then our creative workshop. And I'm really excited to introduce you to our amazing panel this evening. But first, you've got to put up with me, so apologies. But I want us to break the presentation kind of down into 3 main parts this evening. First, I want to talk about why is wildlife traded? What are the key reasons? What are the impacts of the wildlife trade, and particularly the illegal wildlife trade? And how is that linked to zoonotic disease? Because it's quite clear, but it's a very understudied area at the moment. And then I want to look at how international wildlife trade is actually regulated, what frameworks are in place, and what kind of umbrella legislation is there. So that's our menu this evening. So first up, what is international wildlife trade? Well, apologies for the sad picture, this is the only one. International wildlife trade can be broken down into 2 different parts: the legal and then the illegal. And the legal trade of species has actually grown by 200% since 1980, but it's just unfortunately overshadowed by the illegal wildlife trade. And species can be traded perfectly legally in a sustainable way for a lot of different reasons. You can have conservation. You can trade pandas between a zoo in Edinburgh to a zoo in Australia for the purposes of ensuring species survival. You can also trade them perfectly legitimately commercially, as long as it's sustainable. We've probably all bought flowers for someone. Catherine, you've actually got flowers this evening. Hopefully they're traded legally. It's fine to trade animals legally, and that's a separate conversation of whether we should trade animals at all. But the reality is we do, so I don't want to sort of skirt over that. But it's perfectly legitimate to trade animals in a sustainable way that doesn't threaten them to extinction. But the reality is, as I said, the legal trade of wildlife is completely overshadowed by the illegal wildlife trade. And that is kind of why I'm standing here, because otherwise some bears wouldn't live rent-free in my head. But the illegal wildlife trade is quite hard to define because it's so broad. And apologies, I have to read this off the card because I've tried to learn it, but it's very wordy. A common definition, because there isn't actually a universal definition for illegal wildlife trade, is the obtaining, capturing, poaching, smuggling, importing, exporting, processing, possessing, collecting and/or consumption of wild flora and fauna, fungi as well, aquatic or terrestrial, dead or alive, including the parts and derivatives thereof, which are regulated by international legal frameworks. It's pretty wordy. It has to be though, because as I said, there's just so many points at which the illegal wildlife trade can happen. So, as I say, it has to be a very broad definition because it's so nefarious. And it's so nefarious, it's actually really hard to put a value on the illegal wildlife trade. Some estimates range between $7 to $23 billion annually, which is a massive, massive amount. And that is why it's been recognized by international agencies like Interpol, like the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, because it's up there in terms of economic value with illegal arms trading, drugs trafficking, human trafficking, all horrible things. Illegal wildlife trade is up there with that because it's such a big problem. And the UNODC actually published a report earlier this year, and it looked into the number of species that had been captured and reported as seizures, and they're all listed on CITES, which we'll talk about later, but it's a piece of conservation legislation. And between 2015 and 2021, the UNODC found that there have been 3,250 different CITES species captured as part of the illegal wildlife trade. And that's not just one animal per bucket. To put it into context, if you look at the pangolin, which is the most trafficked animal in the entire world because it's believed that their scales have medicinal qualities, even though there is no evidence for that, but it's believed that they treat asthma. that they improve your virility, that they treat acne. Hate to say it, if you like taking pangolin scales, it's not going to help you. Use an inhaler, get some benzoyl peroxide, that'll do you better. But 8.5 million pangolins, which are one of those 3,250 species, were traded between 2015 and 2021. That is a massive, massive number of the most trafficked animals in the entire world. But why? Well, what drives the illegal wildlife trade? It's quite simple, really. There's lots of different reasons, and I could spend hours talking about each of them, but fashion, people like wearing exotic crocodiles. That's up to them. Exotic pet species, the owl in Harry Potter. After seeing that film, the trade in snowy owls went up massively. Traditional medicine, a booming, booming international market, especially in Asia. But I think we can boil it down to something much simpler. It takes me to an ABBA song, which I'm not going to sing, but it's money, money, money. Mm-hmm. And money, money, money isn't really funny when you're an animal traded as part of that. And I want to bring it to life by looking at these two contrasting pictures. So on the left-hand side, you can see some statistics from Statista. Maybe that's not how you say it, but never mind. And essentially, they found that in 2014, the raw price of ivory in China rose to about $2,100 per kilo. And 88% of ivory is traded in China. So your market goes up. What's the result? Well, your average African elephant, and I'm not distinguishing between forest elephants and savanna elephants here, I'm just generalizing. Your average African elephant, their tusks, if they are allowed to grow to adulthood, weigh about 50 kilos each one. Now, I'm not very good at maths, so maybe this is a little bit off, but to me, that gets you to about $105,000 for an elephant dead. I'm not, an astute businesswoman or anything, but to me, that doesn't really seem like a lot when you've got to split it between your kingpin, your processing agent, your importer, your exporter, the man on the ground that does the dirty work. So what do you need? You need scale. And that's why WWF estimates that every 25 minutes, an African elephant is killed for its ivory. So in the time that you have to listen to me, an African elephant will have died for the illegal wildlife trade. $105,000. I'll let that sink in for a second. If we then look at the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the work done by the secret work of elephants in the International Monetary Fund, you can see the value of an elephant alive. And it's a massive number in comparison. It's $1.75 million across their lifetime. Why? Because they provide ecosystem services. They put carbon back into the ground. They are the best form of carbon sequestration, and that helps the climate. They're also keystone species, which means that they help other animals to forage for food they wouldn't necessarily be able to reach because they knock stuff down. They're quite destructive sometimes. They also help animals get to waterways that they wouldn't necessarily be able to access because elephants have the most incredible memories that allow them to reach waterways that have been passed down through generations, which they otherwise wouldn't be able to access. And they take other animals there. But if you think about it, people like to see thriving populations of animals as well. So that drives tourism and ecotourism. That puts money directly back into an economy, which then grows itself. So they're probably worth more than $1.75 million if you think about it. And then if we look at their intrinsic value, their cultural value, their educational value, it's quantifiable. So compare that. That's $1.75 million that an elephant is worth alive, compared to about $105,000 dead. It's not girl math, doesn't make sense to me. And that's why we need to protect them and why we end up with these negative cycles and negative impacts from environmental harm to governance issues. And Alice and Jenny and James will all be able to talk to all of these different issues. But I want to take a little bit of a step back because I think it's very important to think about the fact that sometimes the illegal wildlife trade is referred to as a victimless crime. But you can see on the screen that that's not necessarily true. There are literal human impacts here. It's sometimes just harder to draw those connections. You have to look through sort of indirect pathways. But they're still there. So I disagree with that statement. But I also disagree with that statement from a more fundamental perspective, because, and as the Desmonds will speak to, who are the founders of the first orphanage for chimpanzees in Liberia, there are actual individual victims of the illegal wildlife trade. Every species traded, or every species that loses its life, is a victim, in my opinion. And you can see this. African grey parrots are one of the most trafficked bird species in the whole world because of the demand for them as exotic pets. And studies found that between 66 and 90% reach their destinations dead. Imagine how terrifying that is. Imagine how terrifying being a chimpanzee or an orangutan is when you're taken from your forest home and kept as a pet. It's not natural, it's not normal, and it's probably very frightening. But what's more than that is animals have been studied actually in the wild having an impact or being impacted by the loss of their family members. Mountainous gorillas in Rwanda have been studied actually dismantling steel traps now because they know that they're harmful. African grey elephants are being studied losing their tusks and no longer growing them because that's the source of them losing their lives. So I think it's important just to step back and notice that there are real individual victims of the illegal wildlife trade. But while our speakers can talk to a lot of different things and a lot of different impacts, I want to focus us on the connection between the illegal wildlife trade and zoonotic disease. Now, a couple of you in this room might not know what a zoonotic disease is, but you actually do. Unless you lived under a rock for 2 years, you know what a zoonotic disease is, because COVID is one of them. It's probably the zoonotic disease of our generation, unless it gets overtaken by monkeypox. Again, you're probably also quite well acquainted with the World Health Organization. Again, if you're not, well done, you managed to escape lots of news briefings about them and what they had to say about COVID. But the World Health Organization defines a zoonotic disease as any viral, bacterial, or parasitic pathogen that is spread between a vertebrate animal to a human. And zoonotic diseases are really highly transmissible. They can be spread through conventional and unconventional agents, as you can see. A camel, a monkey. It can be spread through food, it can be spread through water, it can be spread through literal human contact. Sorry, George. Especially because you weren't looking just then. And there are over 200 known types of zoonotic disease, probably even more, and 70% of human pathogens are actually zoonotic in their nature. As I said, you all know what COVID is. COVID is a zoonotic disease, but there's also salmonella. There's HIV. Dr. James Desmond, who hopefully has joined us online, will be able to talk about his research locating the Ebola virus reservoir. There's so many. You know, we've got Mpox now. There's a new one called sloth disease. They're constantly emerging. But what's the connection between international wildlife trade or illegal wildlife trade and zoonotic disease? Well, I think it's quite obvious, really, because, and Alice will be able to speak to this a bit later from her experience literally a few weeks ago. Illegal wildlife trade, by its very definition, means that there is no quarantine, there are no medical checks, there are no vaccinations. Animals are cramped on top of one another in all kinds of conditions where there's no hygiene. You have domestic animals next to an agricultural animal, next to a wild animal, one from Australia, one from Asia, one from America, and people who can just go and touch all of them and then touch their face. It's so obvious how that can make a spillover event, and there's overwhelming evidence of it. If you look at HIV, HIV came from the consumption of illegally traded bushmeat, and bushmeat is the non-human primate. If you eat non-human primates, you expose yourself to different kinds of pathogens you wouldn't necessarily do. COVID, there is the official party line that it spread from a laboratory in Wuhan province. There's also overwhelming evidence that it actually came from a wet market where animals were just in horrendous conditions with no hygiene. And as I said, Alice will be able to tell you exactly about her experience of that and how the connection is so obvious. But that leads me on to the final part of my presentation and looking at the regulations in place so that we can try and stop all of these negative impacts and how we can stop the spread of things like COVID. And there are a variety of different types of legislation and different frameworks out there. You've got the biodiversity plan, you've got soft law, like the Sustainable Development Goals, Target 15, Life on Land. You've also got Under the Sea. They all fit together to create an umbrella that is designed to protect animals from going extinct fundamentally. But I want to focus us just on one of these because we don't have a lot of time. I want us to look at CITES. And CITES is the biggest framework out there. It's designed essentially as a piece of conservation legislation. It's not designed to protect human health. Its goal is fundamentally to ensure sustainability. And it was implemented in 1975, so a long time ago, but it still shows, even with international frameworks in place, we still have massive numbers of animals being treated, so question how effective it is. But as of this year, there are 184 parties to CITES, so it is the biggest piece of conservation legislation out there. And CITES, as I said, is primarily a piece of conservation legislation, and it tries to ensure species sustainability by putting into place a framework and common protocols to ensure that species are not threatened with extinction when they are legally traded. And it does this through a few little objectives. So these are the three CITES objectives: legality, sustainability, and traceability. Legality is that every species traded under the CITES framework has to be sourced legally in connection with the domestic and international legislation. Sustainability, any species traded under CITES, it has to be sustainable because this is a piece of conservation legislation. This is what CITES is concerned with. And traceability, you have to be able to trace the CITES listed species by different permits and different controls. But how? Well, the implementation structure, it looks simple, but a lot of effort goes into it with the convention of the parties, all 184 of them, coordinated by the Secretariat. And it's probably no surprise to all of the lawyers in the room that as an international framework, CITES isn't self-executing. It relies on the different parties to it to put in place minimum standards. And those minimum standards include having a management authority, having a scientific authority. So you can see that here in England, ours is DEFRA, and the Animal and Plant Health Agency, and our scientific authority is the JNCC for animals and the RBG at Kew. So if you ever go to Kew, you've gone to see the scientific authority. Congratulations. But CITES also depends on domestic enforcement agencies as well, so your border control, your police, your APA wildlife inspectors. And that's to ensure that if CITES is breached, that there are proper penalties, because otherwise, wait. So you're probably all thinking, like, Riley, how does this actually protect animals? Where do animals go? And this is the answer. CITES works on a 3 appendices basis, which categorizes animals based on the level of threat that they face. And each party has the opportunity to put forward new species to each convention party meeting. They just have to do it within 156 days. So species can come on and off, depending on different criteria. And that criteria includes, how stable the population is, its geographical spread, how quickly it fluctuates when trade is allowed and when species moves down the appendices. So there are different ways that animals can come on and off the appendices. And as you can see, Appendix 1, we have our poor friend the pangolin, of which 8.5 million traded between 2015 and 2021. So it's no surprise that it falls into bucket 1 or Appendix 1, a species threatened with extinction. And for these species, trade is basically prohibited because it's just so threatening to their survival. If you move down, you have the Australian tree kangaroo, and you can see here that it's a little bit more flexible. Trade is permitted and regulated, but subject to conditions. You also need a bit more paperwork, export permits, re-export certificates, etc. And then you have our least protected, but still protected species like the aardvark. And this is where trade is kind of flexible, easier. They're not threatened so much, but they're still being watched. And about 97% of them fall kind of into the Appendix 2 bucket, about 2% into Appendix 3, and 1% into Appendix 1. So you can see CITES does a really good job at protecting them based on their vulnerability. And just to finish up, I'll leave you on a positive note to say that every animal that has been protected and regulated on the CITES appendices has not gone extinct. So it's doing some kind of good job. But that draws me to the end of my part of the presentation and gives me the great pleasure of now introducing my very lovely speakers. And for that, I need to stop sharing my PowerPoint and stop sharing my PowerPoint. But I'm so, so grateful to be joined this evening by amazing, amazing guests who I also call dear, dear friends as well. So thank you, Jenny, James, and Alice for giving up your time this evening. I'm so pleased to see you. And Jenny, James, I'm really, really pleased to see you guys because I wasn't sure at one point if you were going to be here. But I'm glad you are. So I'll just do a quick intro to all of you because I want our members online and in the room to know just how amazing the three of you are. So on our screen in the top here, we are joined all the way from Liberia with Jenny and Dr. James Desmond from Liberia Chimpanzee Rescue and Protection. As I said earlier, LRCP is the first and only conservation centre in Liberia rescuing baby chimpanzees and slightly older ones who have been victims of the international or the illegal wildlife trade. And they work tirelessly with their team to improve the lives of orphaned and wild chimpanzees. Jenny advocates for the protection of chimpanzee populations by partnering in the fight against wildlife trafficking and through partnerships implementing conservation initiatives, education programs, and better legal frameworks. Dr. James Desmond is by trade a wildlife veterinarian and a consultant specialising in emerging diseases and its connection with the illegal wildlife trade. Dr. James is a graduate of the Tufts Cumberland School of Veterinary Medicine, and he leads the research in identifying the wildlife reservoir for the Ebola virus. And then in the bottom of our screen, we have my lovely friend, Alice. Alice is a global policy specialist at Wildlife Conservation Society, a global NGO whose mission is to save wildlife and wild places through science, education, and inspiring people to value nature. As a global policy specialist, Alice focuses on wildlife trafficking and other nature crimes. She's previously worked as a policy officer at the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, where she contributed to efforts to advance a new UN protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime to prevent and combat the illegal wildlife trade. She's also previously worked at WWF Italy and, in fact, the UNODC, which we were talking about earlier. So thank you all so much for being here this evening. I'm honestly so grateful because I know how busy you all are and how little time you have to do these things because you're doing much more important ones. So thank you so much. And Alice, I have the great pleasure of turning to you first. And hopefully you can kind of see me looking at you a little bit. And you can hear me.
I can see you and I can hear you.
Wonderful. I can see you and I can hear you too. So Alice, as we just discussed, CITES is a piece of legislation that focuses primarily on conservation. It's not really got a broader focus than that, such as health. And as we said, there's a really clear connection between the illegal wildlife trade and zoonosis. So are there any pieces of legislation or international frameworks out there that sort of do bridge that gap?
Well, first of all, thank you, Riley, for organizing this. I think you did a brilliant job with your presentation. As a friend, I'm really proud. As a professional, I know that you don't work on this on a day-to-day basis, so I thought it was impressive. Well done. And thank you to League of Voices for the Future for organizing this. Professionals that work in this field are constantly trying to get new, especially young legal voices like the people in this room to engage and collaborate on this issue. So it's fantastic to be here. Now that we said the positive things, let's dive into let's dive into the depressing part. So you ask if there's an international legal framework to deal with the health risks associated with the international wildlife trade. And the short answer, unfortunately, is no. There is no international legal framework as of now that deals with that. CITES, as you rightly explained, is a conservation instrument that looks at whether the trade in the international trade in wildlife is sustainable and does not pose a risk to the survival of species in the wild. It does not list species based on health criteria. And so it does not look at whether one species or another poses a threat to human or animal health. There was a proposal from the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime that you rightly mentioned is one of my previous employers in 2020 to amend CITES to broaden the mandate, but there was no appetite from CITES parties, and so that proposal did not it died down fairly quickly. But in December 2021. The World Health Organization, WHO, and mainly its member states decided to start negotiating a new instrument, what's called the WHO Pandemic Agreement. And this is an instrument that is supposed to look at prevention, preparedness, and response. So it's supposed to not only prepare us for the next pandemic, but also hopefully prevent it. And the wildlife conservation community, including people in this room, my dear colleagues, Jen and James, have been very vocal in saying that we need this instrument to really look at prevention and make sure that it addresses the drivers of zoonotic disease emergence. So making sure that not only we control the next pandemic when it starts, but we do our very best to prevent it. And in particular, we want this instrument to look into regulating wildlife trade and markets. Now, I have been involved in the negotiations of this instrument for the past a year and a half, I want to say, to about 2 years. It's not a part of my current mandate anymore, but I have seen enough to say that unfortunately, I don't think he will do what we're hoping he should do. And back in March, we worked on an open letter that was signed by 143 organizations calling for the WHO and its member states to really address the risks posed by wildlife trade and markets, and specifically those species that pose an enhanced risk to human and animal health. So yeah, we don't have a framework as of now, but I'm hoping that will change at some point in the future. I'm hoping that will be the case, but the pandemic agreement negotiations are not quite going the way we would want them to go.
Yeah, and you'd think after COVID, there'd be like a renewed sort of optimism and a renewed desire to try and have that prevention in place rather than, what we all sort of dealt with for 2 years.
Yes, and I think you're right. There was. In 2020, I think the momentum was there, and that's what started the negotiations of this instrument. Unfortunately, I think as the emergency stopped being an emergency, and as the lab leak theory became more prevalent, I think it was very convenient for a lot of people to forget that this probably came from a wet market. And in general, even if COVID was not related to a wildlife trade or a wildlife market, we have so many other examples. We have, as you mentioned, AIDS, HIV, SARS, Mpox very recently has become a new crisis. And so, as you said, you'd think that the political will would be there, but not yet.
Not yet, but maybe one day. And that leads me really nicely onto a question for you, Dr. James. As Alice said, there's so many different types of zoonotic diseases out there, even if we don't think COVID maybe came from a wet market, which, the evidence suggests that it probably did. Your work really looks at the study of the Ebola virus. And I was just wondering if you could give us a bit of insight into that and into the connections, and how is this still such an understudied area? Because it seems so obvious to the people in this community and people that work in this field that it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, thank you, Riley. And sorry, we were a little bit late. We got the timing wrong, so we
No
apologize.
worries.
We're usually on the same time as you guys
Yes.
at GMT, and ours doesn't change, and yours does, and
Ours changes. We cause all kinds of problems all the time. We should just do what everyone else does.
Sorry.
But yeah, so and also thank you for inviting us to this. This is a great opportunity. When Jenny told me about it and told me what the discussion was, but I was really excited because as Alice just pointed out, there isn't a lot of work done focusing on there's people like me there's people in the world who look at these links, but not the legal framework. And that's, when you start getting to the policy level, all the different things that we all do to try and prevent pandemics or trying to protect wildlife or biodiversity, it takes all the different levels. So up at the highest levels of international policy work, down to government level, down to people like me who work on Jenny and I who work on the ground, to either save animals or work with trying to prevent the next pandemic. So in terms of Ebola, I'll talk about Ebola specifically, but before I do, generally the way people should be thinking about the pandemic risk or the risk of emerging diseases is that there's millions, probably billions of different microorganisms out there. There's thousands of different species on the planet. And each individual animal or each individual species co-evolves with its own sort of microbiome or its own sort of group of microorganisms. And after all the work we've done on people like me and on several projects over the past, decades, what we found is there's certain taxa of species, primarily bats, rodents, and non-human primates, that pose the most risk to humans. So that's one thing. But then, of course, human behavior plays a huge role as well. So human beings have to come into contact with wildlife, and illegal wildlife trade, so whether it's illegal or legal, is a main avenue. So anytime people are coming in direct contact with wildlife, whether it's through hunting or in markets or whatever value chain you're looking at, where animals are being sourced from the wild or being farmed and then brought to a market or brought to a restaurant, there's a touch point along the way where human beings might become infected by a microorganism that's on that animal. So specifically with Ebola, I have actually one of my colleagues who's on my team when we found the bat is actually Amos Colley is on this call. So hi,
Yes.
Amos. So Ebola is a hemorrhagic fever. It's a filovirus, and filovirus have co-evolved with a wide range of species of bats. And Ebola is not the only type of filovirus, and there's several different strains of Ebola. But obviously, people are concerned about Ebola because it's a very, very scary disease. It has a very high mortality rate. Fortunately, it's not very contagious. The only way you can get Ebola is by coming in contact, the bodily fluids, direct contact with someone who is very sick with or dying from Ebola. And what generally happens is people might be, in the case of what happened in the pandemic in West Africa, the epidemic in West Africa, there was a bat roost that was in a rural community in Guinea, and it's thought that a little boy, a 2-year-old boy, came in contact with a bat. Now, for a bat, Ebola is probably like a cold, right? It may make them a little bit sick, but not very sick. And for humans, and we don't really know why this is. People are doing work on this. But if it happens to jump into humans, it can cause very catastrophic illness. Now, a lot of this has to do with what's called host pathogen relationship, and that's sort of how animals co-evolve with their sort of microbiome and their group of microorganisms. But the big point is that we as humans, our human behavior is one of the main drivers that causes disease emergence. And it takes laws and policies to stop people from doing things they shouldn't, right? So coming into contact with wildlife. So illegal wildlife trade or illegal wildlife markets, or even legal markets, which is a little more scary in places like, in Southeast Asia and China, there's a lot of legal markets where people are farming wildlife. And that just creates basically a cesspool where animals are interacting. It's even a worse environment because you have different species interacting with each other. They're under stress. Their immune systems are messed up or not working correctly because they're under stress and not being cared for. And that's where diseases like COVID came from. So a coronavirus, or SARS, which is also another coronavirus. So I hope I'll stop talking now because I could talk about it forever, obviously, because I find it fascinating. But I'm open for questions, and I'll let. I know you have questions for Jenny as well. So thank you for letting me say a few things about Ebola and zoonotic disease.
Thank you. I could listen to, you for hours, James. It's very interesting what you do. And Jenny, I haven't forgotten about you, but that just draws me back to Alice quickly. Alice, I just wondered if you could give our members online and in the room, because as James was saying, these wildlife markets, they are places of, like, let's be honest, despair, where animals are in such straits of stress and poor health conditions. Can you just tell people a little bit about your experience and how you can see those touch points literally? Because this is post-COVID, let's remember. This was like weeks ago.
Yes, absolutely. I was in two countries, Thailand and China, in August, and the conditions that James described are still very much there. Some things have changed. So in China, for example, there's a wildlife consumption ban. So people are not allowed to purchase and consume animals that were sourced from the wild. But the pet trade, on the other hand, has really exploded. And again, that goes from a number of countries, not only in Southeast Asia and China, but also in Europe. Europe does play a significant role. But going back to my experience, I was there a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, and it is really overwhelming to see the amount of animals that are stacked in small crates and boxes, one on top of one another, different species mixing together, species that in the wild they would never meet because they come from different continents, all of a sudden being stacked on one cage on top of another. I think the thing that was the most concerning for me from a health perspective, not to mention the animal welfare aspect to it, but was seeing just how many open cages for parrots are available for kids to sit next to them and pet them and touch them. And these are animals that are in really poor conditions. Some of these animals are dead, frankly. Like you'll constantly see dead specimens. And others are sick. Others are really, really young animals that just do not have the immune system to tolerate the amount of touching and being handled by kids and adults alike. And so they now, and apparently this is more of a new feature to some of these pet markets, but you see these open cages with parrots being picked by kids, and then they move on to the next cage, and there's a chair right next to it, and they can touch them and handle them, and they move on from one animal to the other, from one cage to the other, and then they're not wearing a mask, and they'll touch their face, and they'll touch each other, and so the conditions are really, really dire for animals, but they're also incredibly concerning for humans.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. And Jenny, I can literally see you on the screen, cringing.
Yeah, we've seen this too. I mean, we've seen this. We've been in a lot of these markets. It's really devastating. And I think all of us here on the panel, and I'm guessing plenty of other people here listening or in the room, are also concerned about animal welfare. I know that's not our discussion today, but I do think it's really important to discuss that component because poor animal welfare, whether it's wildlife or in domestic situations, is such a huge risk for humans in terms of disease transmission because of the duress, because of these animals packed together, the different species interactions. And like Alice said, I mean, humans touching them, playing with them, moving from animal to animal. And for us, yeah, we've seen it in a lot of different places, and yeah, it's devastating. And I know I don't know what question you want to ask me first, but I just wanted to touch on Ebola just to make the point that Liberia had just an absolutely devastating impact from Ebola here. There was a bushmeat ban. I think people were pretty strict about it because they were so scared. It was, I mean, when we got here, the Ebola ban had just lifted, and I mean, it was just everywhere again. We've worked really hard to get things, a lot of the trade off the streets and kind of make it a little less lucrative. Of course, that brings its own issues. But I found it so shocking because, and then COVID came, and yet again, it's just not stopping it. So going back to the legal, the policies, that doesn't mean that's all we do. I think taking a really, multi-sector, multi-layered approach, doing all the different kinds of things, be communication, laws and policies, public health, we have a One Health coordination platform here. So just, I think this kind of lines up with both of what Alice and Jimmy said, and I'm sure what you said, Riley, although I missed most of your presentation. But I think it's just, we're all seeing the same things. So I think, I can talk specifically about chimpanzees if you want. I don't know which question you want to go to first on chimps.
Go ahead. The floor
Okay,
is
so
yours.
I think just that I want to just talk about the broad base, because we're not just about chimpanzees. Yes, we rescue chimps, but we see them as a flagship or keystone species. And I think that's really important. We all talk about those flagship species. Of course, because great apes are so much like ourselves. And of course, chimps share almost all of our DNA. So there is already that issue of that transmission. And while we've been talking about transmission to humans, and Jimmy was talking about a cold for a bat could kill a human, a cold for us can kill a chimp. So just looking at those, those back and forth transmissions between wildlife and humans, and looking at chimpanzees, we call them gardeners of the forest. They're a species who basically keeps the forest alive. They keep ecosystems, their species keeps ecosystems healthy. They're a really great gauge to ecosystem health. So when we talk about communities and the importance of humans to protect individuals and populations like chimpanzees, but not only chimpanzees. It's how we stay healthy. They're the ones keeping our environment healthy. And if we lose those species, or we allow those species to get sick, or we encroach upon their habitat, we're bringing diseases into our own environments and ecosystems. So I think chimps can be seen as that. We look at, if you take a few chimpanzees out of the wild, just to specifically talk about chimps, one chimpanzee who arrives at our sanctuary represents, we say 5 to 10 who were killed in the wild. You're devastating an entire population, and therefore ultimately that ecosystem, and therefore the human population. So it keeps coming back around to humans. So I just think it's important that we look at these kinds of relationships that we have, because it's not just about welfare. I mean, of course, I want to save chimps. I don't want chimps to die. I don't want penguins to die. I don't want, the monkeys we work with to die. But looking at these chimpanzees or great apes, especially primates, as Alice mentioned, non-human primates, animals like bats, species who can really bring diseases to us, and who we can really devastate with our own diseases back and forth.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important connection to draw, and one that I really try to emphasize to people, that the climate crises and the collapse of ecosystems are really the flip side of the exact same coin. If you have one, you also have the other as well. And I think it's, really important, the connection you've just drawn between the fact that zoonotic diseases can go back the other way, from us to chimpanzees. And I wondered if both of you could kind of speak to the work that you do day to day at LRCP, because as I said in my presentation, which maybe you didn't hear, is that sometimes illegal wildlife trade is described as a victimless crime, but you literally have the victims.
Yeah.
You. Could you just explain a bit about, Chauncey, Gracie, anyone you want to pick? But
Sure. I don't have anybody with me today. Sometimes we have them with us, which is,
I know I've met Hori
makes
before.
a much more fun webinar, I guess. But no, that's a good thing. I don't have anyone with me. So it's, of course, it's not victimless. And I would say we have our chimps. We have over 100 now. Again, that represents probably 1,000 killed in the wild, and we estimate 7,000. We have the second largest population of Western chimps in Liberia. So we're looking at, 10 to 20% of our population has been decimated in the short time we've been here. And, again, goes to these laws and policies. But these chimps come in, for anyone who's seen any of our work or seen any of the pictures.
Watch the BBC program. It's amazing. It's
sad,
it's also really lovely.
Yes, it's beautiful, and it's beautiful and rewarding, and it's also really sad and depressing. But having over 100 chimps, that's just, we know each and every one of them, so we can say over 100, but each of them is an individual. Each, you know, a little girl, like you said, Chancey or Mary Beauty, or we just got a little baby named Grace. She arrived, she was paralyzed, completely paralyzed on her left side. We have broken arms and legs. We have, you know, all kinds of injuries. We have chimps who come in with blind in one eye. Most of these injuries are caused by shrapnel that's hit them when their mothers have been killed. And I would say that every single one of them, we know their mother and likely family members have been killed, for sure their mothers. So we know that, again, not victimless. These guys are victims. They come in with post-traumatic stress. Takes a lot of work to get them back in a place where they can actually be happy and smile and interact. They have a lot of social issues. And we also like to say, if you think of the chimps who come in, each of their mothers was killed. So that mother will never have another baby. That means fewer chimps being born. Any girl who comes into our care, she won't have any babies unless we have accidental births, which sometimes happens at sanctuaries. Most of these chimps, it's very unlikely they'll go back to the wild. So it's devastating. You know, the victims are the entire population. And again, comes back to humans because we're devastating the ecosystem they live in. And I also just want to make one point is that I don't want to forget is that humans are also victims of this. In our communities, a few people benefit from this illegal wildlife trade, or even the legal wildlife trade. Only a few people benefit. You know, people go in the forest, they get paid a little bit of money, that goes to somebody else, that chimp gets sold or that meat gets sold. That goes to another person who charges a lot more money. And potentially, if these chimps get past us and they get sent out of the country, that becomes an even bigger income source for somebody. So we're talking about this chain of people. This is exploiting people here. And that's one thing we've really worked with the communities on and found a lot of support for what we do. Where there was a lot of resistance at the beginning, I think people are really understanding, like, yeah, you're right, actually. It's those two guys who always go in and hunt, and they always get the money. And the women are selling the bush meat, but they're getting a little bit of money. But the bush meat that's going out of the country is going to these big dealers who are going to Europe and the US and satisfying, you know, the cultures living there that are wanting the demand for bush meat. So it's not victimless for humans either, you know, across the board. It's certainly not a victimless crime.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I want to ask all of you, what is the balance between, you know, pushing for better legislation? Is that what really works on the ground? Is because you both, you know, all three of you have very different jobs. Alice, you kind of work at the top at the policy aspect, whereas Jenny, James, you work literally on the ground. So I just wondered what your views between you are on what is more effective. Is it actually legislation, or is it actually on the ground education, or is it a combination of all of those things? Field is for whoever wants to go first.
I would say everything, but Alice, go ahead. But I think it's everything. I mean, I don't think there's one thing that's going to stop this.
No, and I have to agree. I mean, I've been advocating now for about 4 years for the adoption of a new global agreement on wildlife trafficking, because as you mentioned earlier, Riley, you mentioned the UNODC World Wildlife Crime Report, and that says that between 3,000 and 4,000 species are being illegally traded worldwide. But I do want to say that those are almost only CITES listed species. There are 8.7 million species of wild animals and plants out there, and CITES only protects about 40,000 of them. So that's a really tiny percentage what's being protected under CITES. And there are millions of other species that could be traded legally or illegally. And so this is one of the reasons why in my previous and current role, I've been advocating and pushing for the adoption of global agreement to prevent and combat wildlife trafficking. And one of the things that I say when I approach government delegates or other NGOs and advocate for this piece of legislation is that there's really no silver bullet that will fix this. There's no one global agreement that will fix this. There's no one law or 1,000 laws that will fix it. You really need everything to work, from the legislation to the on-the-ground work to reducing demand. And I think one of the tricky aspects to this job and to this issue is that quite often reducing demand for illegal wildlife products means reducing demand for legal wildlife products.
Yeah.
And so there are different interests at play, and it can be rather frustrating. But I would fully agree with Jenny. It is very much a holistic approach that we need, from law enforcement doing their job to education to sanctuaries to any honestly, even what we're doing now, spreading awareness and potentially preparing some of the new lawyers or policy officers that will be hired by an NGO 2 years from now because they listen to this. It's all a part of the picture.
Yeah, let me just add, I mean, I think what you're both saying is totally correct, but I think it takes all these different approaches, whether it's like reducing demand or hitting the supply side. It's education, awareness, behavior change. But I think, Alice, what you said is, I mean, you and Jenny both know more about this than me, but Jenny, it really struck me one thing after she had gone to an international meeting about how it's actually the legal trade that makes it really hard to enforce the illegal trade for so many animals. Because how do you track it? How do you know? That's why people are always so worried about, the ivory ban being lifted. Because if that's lifted, then how do you police it? Because if it's legal, then of course there's going to be illegal things happening it's going to be hard to show that they're illegal. And I've dealt with this we're dealing with a small issue here in Liberia about wildlife farming, which we're trying to stop from happening. But once you start something like wildlife farming, I know from my work in China, people who have wildlife farm, whatever they're farming, if they're not good at it's almost like a Ponzi scheme. They sell some animals as a breeding pair to someone else, and then that person starts a farm. But if they don't do a good job with animal husbandry, which a lot of them don't because they don't know what they're doing, then they start sourcing those animals from the wild. And those animals from the wild, it's depleting this has been shown in Vietnam with certain species where the people don't do a good job, and then they're pulling animals from the wild to support their wildlife farming initiative, and it actually has a more devastating effect on wildlife numbers than just hunting alone. So I think there's all these different problems associated with the legal trade versus the illegal trade.
Yeah, can I just make one quick point too, because this always comes up, and especially when you're on the front lines. We're not talking about subsistence farming. Subsistence hunting. So I just want to clarify that because it always comes up. And the person in the community who's killing, I mean, I love if nobody ever ate an animal, but that's not the reality. So, they go out, they're hunting a couple dikers, and even if they're hunting protected species and they're hunting a few and everyone's eating them in the community, we wouldn't be having these conversations if that's all that was happening. With population growth, of course, those numbers increase with subsistence hunting, but the real issue, at least for us here, is commercial trade. And it's illegal here, but it's happening everywhere. And we actually have pretty strict laws here, and we have an amended law that's in front of the legislature now, which will make it even more strict. But we've always been very clear that it's not subsistence hunting. So even though that guy might not be allowed to go hunt that diker, he's not going to get arrested and go to jail. I mean, he's not our target. So I just think it's important to talk about it, because those are two different things. And they may be both illegal. Someplace they may be both legal, but the small time local hunting that's happening in smaller communities is not creating these high risk situations. It's just not. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I think we didn't hit on that. And lastly, I'd just say these kinds of meetings, these kinds of talks, the multi-sector engagement, going to the Interpol meeting with the CSO, the Wildlife Crime Working Group, with the civil societies, that was amazing. I think all of us have to be in the same rooms together, and whether that's online or actually physically in person, and be doing things, this communication and networking. Nobody's come up with something that that's working yet, as far as I can tell. And so we have to keep doing all the things we're doing, keep doing all the things we know work, but we have to also be continuing to think about outside the box. And I think that happens when we all get our brains together and we have these think tanks and we go, hey, that happened to you, that happened to you. And we might come up with this great idea that no one's ever done before. And I think, I hope that we keep doing this. So I appreciate being brought together here by Legal Voice for the Future and groups like Alice and I with the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime and groups like that. I think they're essential to find any types of solutions to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully someone in the room will have been so inspired that they might be the one that thinks outside of the box. So
Yep.
I'm going to actually now throw the questions open to everyone else because you've probably all heard enough from me, but I could talk to you guys for like ever. And this has been absolutely amazing. But Marina, you are in charge. Sorry, we're just working out how to turn the microphone on.
We've been having some problems with the microphone. I'm not sure if they can hear me.
Can you hear Marina?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing.
Cool. Let's start with the online questions because some of our online attendees have been putting questions on Slido. So there's 2 questions. I will ask them both and we can allocate them to the speakers. The first question is, how did the panelists get into this area of work and did they find it challenging to get into? And then there's a question directed at Jenny, which is what you were describing about the harm to the chimp sounds very traumatizing. How do you deal with that? And I presume this attendee is asking, how do you emotionally deal with the work that you're doing?
Oh.
So maybe let's start with Jenny's question, and then I think maybe Alice could give a quick description of how you got into your work in policy, so that we have 2 different answers.
Me first?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. And the question is, how do we help the chimps come through that, or how do I deal with that personally?
Maybe both.
Maybe both, but I have a feeling that they might be asking how you deal with it, how you deal with
Personally, gosh, I don't even know how to answer that. It's hard. It's really hard. It's hard to see those kinds of things over and over and over and over. And we always feel like we're failing. People come in and see what we're doing and say, it's so great, it's so amazing, you made all this progress. And to us, it just feels like, oh my gosh, we're just still failing. We're failing, So I think all of us can relate to that because you always want to be doing more and it's never fast enough. But I think focusing, really the only way we can deal with that specific level of these individuals who come to us is focusing on the progress. Like I mentioned, Grace with her paralyzed side. I spent 2 months with her just doing what I thought I should try and do to move those limbs around. And she didn't even know they were there anymore. She had decided they didn't even exist. So starting to have her look at them and put them in her mouth and things like that. And she actually, I don't know, if you guys go to our Instagram, you'll see some exciting videos on Gracie because she is now running around as fast as she can. And she falls sometimes, but she's using both her arm and leg. And I mean, it's for us, that's miraculous. So I think focusing on that. And if the question's about how we deal with the chimps, we do one-on-one, very intensive surrogate mothering. They're also with other chimps, so they really get that, what they need to be around other chimps. They really need that, but they also need that one-on-one intensive replacement mommy. And so we do those kinds of things and psychological and physical stuff. Jimmy's the vet, but he always is like, that's the small part of the job. The rest is the psychological damage that they come in with. So
I think just to chime in there, I think, we all as people who really care about animals, as I started off my presentation saying, I saw a picture of a sun bear at a bear bile farm. And that is literally the reason I'm standing here today. And that is why I've educated myself so much. And at times it can feel so overwhelming and like you as individuals just can't stop what's happening. But the reality, I think, that all of us have come to realize is that there is an amazing community out there. Alice and I became friends because of this shared interest. Jenny, we had a call years ago because of this. And it's that keeps you going. And it's, having forums like this where you connect with people who share and care about the same things as you, that you kind of realize, oh my gosh, there's other people out there who care. And that's what keeps you going as well.
Yeah.
Alice, floor is yours. Sorry for interrupting.
No, and honestly, I don't know if I can, if I can follow that because Jenny was so good, and what I'm going to say is not as important at all. But I do love the question of how I got into this because everyone advised against it. I graduated from law school in 2019, and I had written my thesis on environmental criminal law, but I decided the moment I graduated law school that I was not going to qualify and take the bar and become a lawyer. And that shattered hearts all over my family. Everyone was, saying, you'll regret this. This is the worst decision you'll ever make. Talk to me in 2 years' time and we'll see. And thank God I listened to whatever crazy voice was in my head at that point, because I didn't even know that this career existed. I had no idea that you could work and in policy for an NGO. I had no idea that there are so many things that you can learn and do in this career that are so fulfilling. And so how I did that was I started by going to the one place that I knew had a wildlife crime program, which is the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. I was very lucky. I did not get an internship with them, but I got one in the terrorism prevention branch. And I thought I'm going to use this opportunity to network my way in. And it ended up working. And I had a great experience at the UNODC. I then switched into the wildlife crime space. And instead of working in environmental law for a firm and making profits for a law firm, I thought animals are my only client from now on for the rest of my life. And I'm now at a point 4 years in where has it been 4 or 5 years? I don't even know. Where
I love it so much. It's going so quickly.
No, but it really is. It really is a fulfilling journey and frustrating, incredibly frustrating. I always say that there are a few traffickers out there that should pay for my therapy bill, and I think Jenny and James can relate to that. But it is a really great job, and there's so much fulfillment that comes with it. The people in it are amazing. Everyone is really driven and motivated, and so I really hope that, if anything, you live this conversation today feeling like, well, I do have a law degree. I do have that background. How do I make the most of it? And it doesn't have to be becoming a global policy specialist for a global NGO, because look at Riley. Riley has taken a very different path, and she is doing amazing things for our planet and animals. And there are amazing people that do this for farm animals. There are amazing people that do this for climate change. It does not have to be wildlife crime. That happened to be my thing and the thing that I feel so passionate about, but the sky's the limit. There are so many opportunities out there that people just don't know about. And so if you're ever interested, reach out on LinkedIn, or Riley, feel free to share my email. I feel like we need more lawyers in this space. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
I just was going to say, I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV. No, I came here and I had to immediately start writing an amended law, and I was like, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what you're talking about. But
I remember having to look at a draft of it, actually.
yeah, I think that's when I was in touch with you, Riley. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm going to put in whatever I think should be in here. Somebody can look at it. But it's taken us a lot of years to get it to happen. But I just wanted to point out that even from our level of what we're doing, and I do stuff on regional and global level as well, but the legal components of the work that I did, that you would think you're doing rescue, reintroduction, you're doing conservation. The legal components have become, and the policy stuff that we're doing, whether that's in Liberia or in West Africa or beyond, has become just one of the most critical parts of what we do. So I think you can get involved at any level, really. And it's so key. I mean, without it, for me, I just feel like none of the other stuff we're doing would work. It wouldn't come together. So yeah, as a non-lawyer, going away.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm just gonna ask if anyone in the room wants to ask a question. we're running a bit short on time, so if you could just introduce yourself and give a short question to any of the panelists.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for the brilliant presentation. My name is Nisha. I'm a lawyer, focusing on insurance and dispute resolution, but also ESG and climate change. And my favorite story, or one of my favorite stories over the summer, was about an Italian doctor and his son who were arrested in Sri Lanka for trying to smuggle out of the country thousands of butterflies. And it was crazy because they just seemed to be, they thought they could just get away with it, and it's just butterflies, and yet they were arrested, and it made a big splash. So it was a very heartening story. And the work you do, all three of you, sounds very amazing and important. And my question is, what do you think the corporate space can or should be doing more to assist on these things? Obviously, with my insurance background, risk popped up as a huge element, and maybe something that needs to be advertised more if you look at how many lawsuits and how much damage the COVID pandemic has been, and it's clear link to zoonotic diseases. And secondly, you also mentioned the fact that large markets are in the US and Europe for this kind of bushmeat. So where are they, and is there more of a communication that can be done, and what can be done to curb demand, really? Thank you.
Alice, I think maybe it might,
You take us.
that might fit you first, and then. if
All
you
right,
could-
sure. Thank you. Thank you for your question. With regards to what the corporate sector, the private sector can do, there is a lot that the private sector can do. And, you know, I said earlier that I'm very proud to work in the NGO space, and I really am. But that does not mean that the private sector can contribute immensely to this issue. One of the one of the things that I work as a part of my portfolio is financial crime and money laundering. And banks and in general, financial actors can play such a huge role in that space, and making sure that they include wildlife trafficking in their risk assessments. That's something that really we could have a whole other conversation about, but banks and financial institutions can play a really, really important role there. And then perhaps closer to what some of you will end up experiencing in your career. For example, if you work on data privacy, you might think, well, this is not really relevant to what these people are doing, but we have so many amazing law firms out there that help NGOs pro bono and do really amazing work with, more recently, data privacy. These are things that NGOs don't know how to deal with and don't have the in-house expertise to deal with. So if you are in your law firm, one of those vocal people saying, hey, what sort of pro bono work are we doing this year, this month? And how about we look for an NGO that deals with wildlife trafficking or any other environmental crime that we can be helpful with? Or how about if you're a civil law, firm or deal with contracts, how about we help Jenny with contracts that they might have to deal with for any sort of procurement? Because really, all NGOs, all sanctuaries, all zoos and aquariums, everyone has to deal with some sort of legal issue at some point. And the fact that there are law firms out there that offer these pro bono services is really huge. And it's something that I don't think we talk about enough. So thank you for anyone who does that and who do that in the future.
Yeah, and I was going to say also the transport sector is a big sector for us. We work very closely with the transport sector because this is how stuff's getting sent around, right? Whether bushmeat or live animals. So I think being, you know, if you're involved in the legal aspects of the transport sector, or just what Alice was saying, and you just touched on something. I see my friend Maribel here, my wonderful friend who is working for conservation litigation, and they're working with us and several other countries to do civil cases. So cases on behalf of chimpanzees or on behalf of nature. So I think there's that whole component that you can get involved in. And then the last thing I was going to say about corporate sector, which, I mean, we could go on, I'm sure, but artificial intelligence, technology, all of those kinds of things are being used to help us fight wildlife crime, from front lines up to, being able to identify different types of wildlife and where it came from, and looking at the value chain. So I think there's just so much opportunity to get involved. And like Alice said, you just have to be vocal and go in and push your organization to take a step forward in that component.
And most corporations have a
Social
corporate social
responsibility.
responsibility program. And some of those corporations, like for example, in the mining industry, so there's a lot of mining here, it's like a voluntary thing. And one thing that I think would be nice to have change is that it's not voluntary. Like
Right.
they have to commit a certain percentage of their profits, to certain areas, so for the
Offsets.
mining, they have to do conservation offsets, but they try and avoid doing it unless they're getting money from the IFC, then they don't really have to do it. So so there's different things like that. So the people in the room or on the call who are, young lawyers are just starting out, like there's all these different areas that Alice knows a lot of, that you all know a lot more about than me. But again, it's these legal frameworks that really make a difference on the ground for animals and other wildlife.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of chime in there, like Lucia, you're one of those vocal voices at your firm, and I'd like to think that I am at mine. And the way I've kind of got around it, when there was like no buy-in whatsoever, like you cannot talk possibly about how biodiversity litigation is relevant to a corporate law firm. Are you insane? And now, like last week, I actually did a presentation to my entire team about climate and biodiversity litigation. The more you keep on at people, the more they start listening to you, basically. And if you can convince a corporate law firm, hey, you're going to make money out of this. You're going to make money when eventually somebody's going to come back and be like, hey, I'm going to instruct you for real this time because you did such a great job pro bono. They're going to be like, great, sure, money in my pocket. And also, look at me, I can put things on my website that I've done this great thing. You kind of have to feed into their own egos a little bit, but know that you know what it's like, Lucy. I can see you laughing.
I did want to add one other thing. Some of the most successful work we do here is with judges and prosecutors. And I just was thinking about, we've had some amazing lawyers come here from all, different law firms. We've had lawyers help us with their law pro bono. We've also had lawyers come in from some of the conservation law firms. And really, that's something you can really help with too, is going into a country like ours or into a region like West Africa and doing some workshops with judges and prosecutors to just help them understand the global scale of it. And then how do we use different laws to fight it? Because one thing we said, it started with we have this wildlife law. Well, now we know there are a lot of other laws we have here to our advantage, but we didn't know that until we had that kind of advice and guidance. So I think even those kinds of things coming in and providing that expertise is invaluable to the work that we do here on the ground.
Yeah, and I just want to make one point about the woman who asked the question and mentioned that she worked in the insurance industry. I mean, that is a potential huge area where it could have an impact, because we all know how much COVID costs the globe. Pandemic risk is a real thing. And I'm not sure how it works. I don't know how the insurance industry functions, but I do know it has it's a massive industry and everything is about making bets on different risks that they're taking. And so that kind of pressure could cause governments to make changes if they were at risk of, losing funding for some reason or not, or bond ratings. Again, I'm not sure how this all works, but I know that there's people who've looked into this in terms of how pandemic risk. And I'll make a point about COVID. It cost the world trillions of dollars, and the mortality rate for COVID was, like 1%. And I think in some ways, I wish it had.
Don't say what you're going to say.
Well, I mean, the thing is,
don't say what you're
no,
gonna
but
say.
not because I want more people to die, but if the mortality rate had been, say, 10%, then every single person on the globe would have known someone directly who had died. Whereas that wasn't the case. And so there was all these conspiracy theories, and it created this political firestorm all over the world. which is still reverberating today because a lot of people thought it was like a hoax or it was a made up thing, you know? But the next time, I mean, there's an avian influenza that's circulating around the United States right now in the dairy industry. And I just saw a report the other day of there was a human being who got sick with avian influenza, was hospitalized without any contact. So that means that there might be human to human transition. And once that happens, I mean, you know, the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. So these things are going to keep happening. The pandemic risk is always there, unless we as humans try and mitigate that risk by changing our behavior.
Thank you. We are really running